He slapped me, right there in front of his family, in front of mine, in the place we once called paradise. All because I spilled wine on the wrong woman's dress. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just stood there and waited for the silence to do its job. My name is Cambria. This was supposed to be our vow renewal, but what he didn't know was that I didn't come to stay married. Where are you listening from tonight? If you've ever been silenced, subscribe. This story's for you. The Timberline Lodge was still frozen, 15 years, and the wind still howled the same way down its wooden corridors, like it remembered everything. We were here once before when I was 26, barefoot in snow, wearing nothing but a white silk dress and hope. That was our honeymoon. This was our vow renewal. The same chandeliers, same crackle from the fireplace, same scent of cedar and expensive linen. But I wasn't the same woman. And Elias had learned how to make his lies sound like lullabies. He stood across the lobby laughing with the sommelier, his hand light on the arm of a woman in burgundy. Marin Wade. She was younger, fresher, styled like a woman who always knew where the cameras were. I watched them from behind the concierge desk, pretending to check the floral delivery schedule. She leaned in to whisper something. He smiled. It was the same smile he gave me, in this very lobby, 15 years ago, when he handed me a cup of mulled wine and said, "You warm every room you enter." Now I was the cold one, and they were the ones glowing. Ms. Holt, the event coordinator, interrupted gently. "Just confirming, would you like the champagne tower revealed before or after your speech?" My speech. The one I wrote, rewrote, then rewrote again, until it no longer sounded like someone begging to be loved. I smiled after. She nodded and vanished down the hallway. Efficient, professional, unlike me standing there in heels too tight, holding a glass of truth in my pocket. "Hey." Elias waved across the room. I waved back. That's what we did now, pretended beautifully. We were the aspirational couple in the photos. The healer and the artful wife, a surgeon, a former choreographer, elegance with backstory. People admired us, but I was done performing. Back in our suite, I unzipped the gown I'd chosen weeks ago. Green velvet, the same shade as the dress I wore the night he proposed. That night I had danced barefoot in the snow for him. Tonight I would not dance. I slipped the SD card into the lining of my clutch, tucked behind a satin handkerchief embroidered with the word Grace. I sat on the edge of the bed watching the snow swirl outside the window. My hands were steady, my heart wasn't, because deep down I still wanted it to be wrong, still wanted Elias to prove me paranoid. Still wanted the woman in burgundy to be just that, a guest, a co-worker, a harmless participant in a pretty weekend. But women like me don't get to be naive twice. A knock on the door. "Wyatt?" My brother stood in the hallway holding a single black coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said. His eyes searched mine. "I'm okay," I lied. He didn't answer, just stepped inside and sat beside me, both of us staring at the snow. "You don't have to go through with it," he said. "I do. Then I'll stand where you need me." When we were kids, Wyatt once punched a neighbor's kid for calling me weird. He didn't say a word, just took the hit, then walked me home. Not much had changed. Only now the man I needed protecting from was the one who once promised to protect me. I adjusted the clasp on my bracelet, looked into the mirror once more. The woman staring back didn't blink. She had spent 15 years in a house made of second chances. Tonight she would burn it with silence. Downstairs, guests gathered near the arched windows. Champagne flowed like a promise, laughter like snow, pretty cold, forgettable. Marin was telling a story. She touched Elias's arm like she owned part of it. I walked past them slowly, not looking back. Every step was a vow I no longer needed him to make. Every breath a rehearsal for the moment I'd stop being his wife. and start being someone he'd never forget. It wasn't just the color. It was the way she wore it, burgundy velvet, cut to the shoulder, a hint of shimmer in the candlelight. The same shade I wore on our wedding night. 15 years ago, I walked into the reception wearing a dress Elias said he picked with eternity in mind. His exact words, "This color was made for you." Back then, I believed him. Tonight, he said the same thing to her. I know because I heard it even before he knew I was behind them. They stood near the hearth fire, flickering warm shadows behind them. She laughed too hard. He leaned in too close, and then low and smooth. "You wear that color like it was meant to find you." She giggled. I stopped breathing. Burgundy, a choice, not a coincidence. There were no dress codes for this event, no theme. I had picked emerald green for myself to honor the forest that surrounded this lodge. But burgundy? That was our color, a private memory now worn on the skin of another woman. And he spoke the same words like love was a script he recycled for the next audience. I stepped back into the hallway, heart oddly quiet, not broken. Just reorganizing, rewriting everything I thought was mine. What else had he borrowed? What else had he repurposed? The way he cupped her elbow, the wine pairing notes, the playlist. No, I wouldn't fall apart here, not before the moment I came for. From across the room, Marin looked radiant. So did I once. Now she wore my dress, my color, my compliment. But what she didn't know was that I still had the ending. And she was standing in the middle of it. I walked into the dining hall 2 minutes before the first course. Everything looked perfect until I saw the head table. The chair beside Elias wasn't mine. It had a place card, gold embossed. Ms. Marin Wade. She was already seated, smiling, her hand resting lightly on the edge of Elias's thigh. He leaned toward her, saying something I couldn't hear, but her reaction, a soft laugh, the kind you don't fake, told me enough. I stopped. Looked again. There was no other seat flanking him. Not even a placeholder for me. Bye. The coordinator spotted me from across the room, hurried over with a folded map. "Oh, Mrs. Holt, you're right here." She pointed to a table 2 rows down next to the sommelier and the pianist's assistant. "Bye. We thought you might want a more peaceful seat away from the photographers." I didn't answer, just walked to my new place, sat, smoothed the velvet over my knees. From here I could still see Elias. I just couldn't reach him, not physically, not metaphorically. 15 years of being the woman beside him. Now I was adjacent, an afterthought with a napkin. Wyatt slid into the seat beside me, offered no commentary, just poured me water and flicked his gaze toward the front. "Intentional," he muttered. "I know." This table's symbolic. I didn't flinch, didn't make a scene, didn't demand my rightful seat. Because that chair, the one beside Elias, was no longer mine, and the woman sitting there would soon learn why some seats come with consequences. The USB wasn't always in my clutch. For weeks I didn't even know it existed, and once I did, I wasn't sure I wanted it. Wyatt handed it to me 3 nights before the vow renewal. He didn't say much, just placed the silver stick on my kitchen counter like it was salt or poison. "This came in today," he said. I didn't touch it, didn't ask what was on it. I think he expected that. Wyatt never liked Elias, but he loved me enough to wait. I stared at the USB for hours that night, left it next to the stove while I boiled pasta, moved it to the windowsill while I folded towels. Finally, I slipped it into the pocket of my coat, still unopened. It wasn't until 2 a.m. when the snow outside turned to ice that I plugged it into my laptop. No passwords, no folders, just one file. Suite 213, Feb 14, lobby mic wave. Bon? Their voices were grainy at first, then clearer. "Elias, she still thinks I'm doing this to renew us. Marin, aren't you? Elias. No, I'm doing this to close the chapter. Pause, clink of glass, soft laughter. Elias again. Cambria likes to think silence means grace. I let her have that illusion. I didn't cry, didn't flinch, just pressed pause. And let the quiet fill the room like fog in a cathedral. Nah. The next morning, I packed the USB in my clutch, wrapped it in tissue, slipped it behind the embroidered handkerchief. No label, no note. If I didn't need it, it would stay hidden. But if the time came and I needed the truth to speak, I wanted it close enough to burn and cold enough to cut. The toast wasn't for me, but I was the only one who noticed. The host tapped his glass 3 times. The room dimmed slightly, servers paused. The hum of string music softened. Ladies and gentlemen, he began. Please join me in welcoming the man of the hour, Dr. Elias Holt, to say a few words about love that lasts. Applause. I held my glass steady, not tight, not shaking, just prepared. Elias rose from his seat from her side and walked to the center of the floor. Marin tilted her face toward him, soft as moonlight. I saw her fingers graze his wrist as he passed. He didn't pull away. My friend's Elias began 15 years ago. I stood in this very place. I made promises. Some I kept, some I misunderstood. A pause. The room shifted. Polite chuckles, a few nods. But today, he continued, today. I want to talk about what we learn when time does its work. That's when I knew. This speech wasn't about us. It was about him, his growth, his narrative. He didn't say my name once. Didn't mention our first apartment. Didn't reference the winter I stayed up every night tracking his recovery patients by phone because he was too exhausted to chart. Didn't speak of the miscarriage or the garden I built when we couldn't talk. No. Instead, he said, sometimes the right person enters your life after the wrong season ends. The room murmured. People smiled, mistaking poetry for wisdom. I stared at him. He looked straight ahead, not at me, but at her. Wyatt didn't speak. He just tapped his ring once softly against his glass. 3 beats, sharp, final. Elias raised his champagne. To new beginnings, he said. And I smiled, because that was the last thing he should have said to me. She was sitting where I used to. Right there on the velvet bench near the hearth, legs crossed. Drink in hand, shoulders tilted into the fire like it belonged to her. Marin. The woman beside the fire knew nothing about snow. 15 years ago, I curled up on that same bench in a white robe, wet hair wrapped in a towel, my feet tucked into Elias's lap. We had hiked in freezing wind that day. I'd twisted my ankle in the snow. He carried me back. We made cocoa. He said, no matter where life takes us, I'll bring you warmth. Now she sat in my memory without knowing it. She didn't flinch from the heat, didn't look around like it meant anything, because to her, this was just a cozy seat near the bar. But to me, it was a graveyard. But I stepped closer, quiet shoes, steady spine. She glanced up, smiled, politely, like women do when they think you're just another guest with a tired smile. She didn't know what I knew, didn't know I'd heard the recordings, didn't know about the USB in my clutch, didn't know the weight of 15 winters could sit behind someone's eyes and look like calm. Wyatt appeared beside me, didn't speak. Just stood there. He didn't need to ask if I was ready. He only needed to see my face and know that I'd crossed whatever line there was left. I didn't want revenge. I didn't need a confession or an apology or his career. What I needed was distance and clarity and one moment where the truth stood louder than his voice ever had. Marin turned back to her drink, smiling at something Elias said from across the room. The fire cracked. Someone laughed nearby. Snow brushed against the lodge windows like breath on glass. I looked at Wyatt. He nodded once. The woman beside the fire was warm. But I remembered how bitter snow could taste when it melted down your back and no one offered you a towel. And that was when I knew. This story would end not with a scream, but with a scream. I waited until the violins played their final note. Until the guests had returned to their seats, napkins folded, wine refilled. Until the microphone was placed delicately in the center of the floor. They thought I was going to speak, so I did. Just not the way they expected. Then I walked up with slow, measured steps. Wyatt stood near the tech table. A flick of his finger rested near the remote control. The USB was already slotted in. The projector blinked once, waiting for my cue. I turned to the crowd. Elias stood at his table, smiling like a politician in a tux. Maureen beside him adjusted her earrings. I held 2 glasses of red wine. One for me, one for her. I walked directly toward their table, still smiling. My face calm, my hands steady. Dr. Holt. I said, may I? He looked amused, pleased. I'd be honored. Marin reached for her glass, and that's when I let it slip just enough. The wine splashed in a perfect arc, spilling down the front of her velvet burgundy dress. Gasps. Marin stood up, mouth open, hands lifted like wings. You, she hissed. I'm so sorry, I said quietly, grabbing a napkin from the table, blotting gently and completely missing. Then Elias snapped. Wow. Are you out of your mind? He barked. I looked up. You ruined her dress. It was an accident. He stepped forward. No, it's always something with you. Always. Elias, I said softly, please not here. But he didn't stop. You can't let someone else shine for once, can you? His voice rose. You always have to make it about you. And then he slapped me, open palm, right cheek, hard. The entire room went silent. I didn't fall, didn't touch my face, didn't move. I simply turned, looked at Wyatt, nodded once, and he pressed play. The projector screen lit up behind me, a familiar timestamp, familiar voices. Elias, she still thinks I'm doing this to renew us. Marin, aren't you? Elias, no, I'm doing this to close the chapter. Gasps rippled. Cambria, she still thinks silence means grace. The words echoed, faces turned, mouths opened, some covered in disbelief, some disgusted, some just quiet. Elias stared at the screen like a man watching his life burn. Marin backed away from the table. A woman in the front row whispered, "She's the mistress." Another said he hit her. I saw it. I heard it. Elias tried to speak, but there was no script left. Only sound, only silence. I stood still. Didn't look at him, didn't speak again. Wyatt stepped beside me, placed a hand on my back. Not support, just presence. The screen darkened. The wine on Maureen's dress began to turn black in the candlelight. Someone clapped. Soft, 2 beats, then more. Not loud, not applause, but acknowledgement. No. The coordinator approached me, asking if I wanted to go somewhere private. I shook my head. Then walked past Elias, who stood frozen, eyes wet, but not from tears. From fear. Because now they knew. Now everyone knew. And there was no elegant exit for a man like him. Then, as I left the ballroom, I heard Marin behind me. She planned this, she whispered. She planned it. Yes, I did. Because nothing says ending quite like the sound of truth played through surround sound, and a slap heard by 100 people who will never look at you the same again. Marin didn't follow me out, but her voice did that sharp, breathless panic of someone watching her reflection shatter. Elias, say something, fix this. But there was nothing left to fix, only pieces. That. I reached the end of the corridor before my mother-in-law caught up. still in heels, still wearing her silver brooch like a badge of class. Cambria. She started, her voice tight with confusion and control. I'm sure this misunderstanding can be addressed more privately. I turned to her, calm, upright, composed. Privately is how this began, I said. And that's why it lasted this long. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, like she'd forgotten I was capable of finishing a sentence without Elias editing the tone. Behind her, Marin's father looked pale, his drink untouched. The sponsors from the hospital board had already begun to leave. Thon. Wyatt stayed by the ballroom doors, hands in his pockets, unmoving. He wasn't just my brother tonight. He was my witness, my evidence, my last safety net, not because I was falling, but because I had decided I never would again. Elias didn't chase after me. He didn't call my name, didn't reach out, didn't try to perform sincerity one last time, because he knew that anything he said would echo against 100 people's silence and ring false. Back in the suite, I changed out of the green velvet gown, folded it carefully, placed it into my suitcase with the same tenderness you give to something that no longer belongs to you but still deserves respect. Then I took off my wedding ring, not in anger, not in ceremony. I set it on the bathroom counter beside the glass I used to rinse away mouthwash every morning, beside routine, beside things I no longer needed. The USB I kept. Not for leverage, not for memory, but to remind myself that silence may be graceful, but truth is a weapon only dangerous to those who fear it. As I zipped up my bag, I heard Wyatt knock once. Then, "You ready?" I opened the door. He didn't smile, he didn't speak. He just took my suitcase and walked ahead. And I followed him not because I was leaving something behind, but because I was finally walking towards something that didn't need Elias in it at all. 2 weeks passed. No articles, no interviews, no carefully curated statements. Just silence, which was exactly what I wanted. Elias called twice, once from his office line, once from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. He didn't leave voicemails, which told me he was still performing for someone, just not me. Marin disappeared from social media. Her once daily posts about growth healing and aligned love vanished like smoke. I heard through someone I didn't ask that the hospital placed Elias on indefinite leave, that the board was re-evaluating his leadership role, that the donor gala was postponed. None of it surprised me. None of it pleased me either, because what I wanted was never his downfall. It was just my space back, my name, my story, my voice without footnotes or disclaimers. I moved into a smaller place. A 2-story cottage near the river trail, white trim, exposed brick. Enough room for a yoga mat, a tea kettle, and a peace lily. Everything I kept was intentional. The books I reread. The photos I didn't hang, the ring I didn't sell but stored in a plain box under a faded program from our wedding. Not because I couldn't let go, but because closure for me wasn't about erasing, it was about arranging. Every morning I woke at 6:30. Lit a candle, boiled water, played the same instrumental track I choreographed to, in my 20s back when I still believed every movement meant something beyond pain. And then I moved. Alone, unwatched, not for performance, not for anyone else's applause. Just breath and presence, and the slow return of a woman who no longer needed to be loved to know she was worth something. Some nights I still heard the echo, the slap. Not the sound of it, but the silence that followed. It wasn't pain I remembered. It was the stillness, the clarity. Like a room where all the furniture had been removed, and you could finally hear your own breath again. Wyatt visited often. He never brought it up. Never asked if I was doing okay. Just cooked dinner, used my herbs wrong, and left clean dishes in the rack. That was his way of saying you're not alone. Want. One Thursday morning, I got a letter, handwritten, No return address. The envelope smelled faintly of cloves. Inside a single card. I thought I was taking your place. Now I see you left it empty on purpose. M. No apology, no pity, just recognition. That too was enough. My former in-laws sent flowers, a white orchid in a glass vase, no note. I gave it to the front desk at my building. Elias never came in person, but his lawyer emailed mine with 3 lines. Full asset release, no contest. She deserves more than explanation. He was right. I didn't want explanation. I wanted exactly this. Space, autonomy, no more performances. Months passed. The vow renewal became something people whispered about at dinner parties, then forgot when new scandals took its place. But I remembered. Not because I was bitter, but because it marked the day I stopped waiting to be chosen, and chose myself instead. One morning, I stood by my window, watching steam rise from a chipped mug, and realized I no longer thought of myself as someone's ex-wife. Not even as someone betrayed, just someone. Someone whole, someone quiet, someone who didn't need a vow to know she was already complete. I opened the door to my studio, lit the incense, and wrote in chalk on the board above the mirror, "We do not begin again. We begin honestly." That was the lesson. That was the end. Or maybe just the truest beginning.